Hi, this is Dawn from Ninja Money Crochet. Today I have a special guest with me. I have Cecil from Hoo Hoo Creations, and she's going to show me how to line a crochet bag. I've never done this before, and this is the bag right here that we are going to line today. Put that in the camera. This is just your basic granny square bag. This sunflower right here, I have a tutorial how to make this sunflower granny square. I will link that in the description box below, and the back is just your basic granny square in matching colors. So I will turn it over to Cecil, and she's going to show us how to cut the fabric, and we're going to be hand sewing it, correct?
Yes.
So we will turn it over to her, and she's going to show us how to line this bag.
This is our lining fabric. It is a adorable bumblebee print. This was purchased at Walmart for about $6. So they're not too expensive, and you do get a whole yard. So we're just going to take that off and put your fabric to the side. Next, you're going to take your measuring tape and measure the width. This is about 52 centimeters, or approximately 21 inches. You do want to leave about ½ inch for seam allowance, and then wherever the top of your bag is, you're going to go about ½ inch down because you don't want it completely flush. And then you're going to measure to the bottom, which is almost exactly 14 inches, and we're going to add ½ inch of seam allowance. So 14.5 by 21. And then we'll put your project to the side and bring back our fabric. Now, the nice thing about when you buy fabric by the yard is you have both sides, which comes in handy because then there's one less seam that you have to make depending on what you're making, how you're making it, and if you want one less seam. So we're going to make these selvage over here. We're going to make this one of the seams. So we're going to work off of that. So we still need to cut 2 equal squares. Should be able to see that on here. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of times when you're buying fabric by the yard, it's not completely even. The selvage edges aren't completely even. If that's the case, go ahead and line them up. Take a pin and just pin them together. You can also pre-wash and iron, but that's a lot of extra work. So go ahead and just put a couple of pins and make sure the edges are lined up. And 4. And sometimes the edges at the very top, they usually line up pretty perfectly, but not always. That depends on if it was cut with the edges flush together or not. Now once you've done that, you have to flatten the bottom out and the side out again. So now we have a new edge. Just go ahead and pin that together. And 3. So now we have a new perfectly flush yard of fabric. Again, as I said down here, you can see it doesn't line up flush, and that's fine. If that happens, you can just take your scissors and cut it. It's not a big deal because we are going to have that seam. So now we're going to take our measuring tape and a marking tool. You can use a dressmaker pencil, you can use chalk, you can use pen, pencil, crayon. That won't come out, but you can use a crayon. Just something that you can mark with so you know where to cut. So we had 21 by 14 and a half. So marking from the edge out, 21 is right here, right where the pen is. So just go right ahead and mark that. And then repin. My white is not showing up super well, but as long as you can see it, that's what's important. And then just mark up a couple of times. It doesn't need to be exactly at your height dimension, so long as it's at least as tall or approximate to that. So that's 2. Put a pin. And 3 should be enough. 21. Mark. Over. Mark. And pin. Okay, now that you have those 3 pins, we can do our height. Excuse me. 14 and a half is right up here. Right out of view, okay. So, oops. 14 and a half is right up here. Go ahead and pin it down. And 14 and a half. And then you always measure from the shortest bit. Is right here. Now obviously they don't automatically meet up, and that's fine because these are just your guide marks. And then if you have a fold just a little bit above your seam allowance, go ahead and use that as your first cut guide, and then you can go ahead and make further alterations. So with our bag liner marked out, go ahead and cut. And you'll have quite a bit left over you can use for a second bag. This fabric here is enough to make a costume bodice or corset lining, or you could make some dishcloths out of this. Cotton is really versatile and it can make just about anything with a pretty small amount. So go ahead and fold that back up. And there you have about a half a yard of fabric. Go ahead and put that off to the corner. And then we still have about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of unnecessary seam allowance. And what you can do for that to get a nice clean cut is go ahead and fold everything up. And go ahead and remove that pin so that's not in the way. There you go. You're gonna, if you're doing this method of removing that pin and folding it up so you get an easier, cleaner cut, make sure you have at least one of your markings visible. Otherwise, you might hit a pin, you might damage your scissors, or have to unfold it, remark everything again, and that's a pain. So we have ours right here. And the white chalk is kind of grabby, but that's fine. Go ahead and remark again, just in case. So 14.5 is a little more than that, and that's fine. 14. Go ahead and make yourself a couple of cuts, a couple of lines, a couple of marks, sorry, so that you know where you're cutting. And then go ahead and cut your fabric. And this leaves you with a very small fabric remnant. This can be used for just about anything. You can use it to make a little bit of bias binding. You can use it for handle lining in the bag if you so wish. You can do just about anything. And here it is a little uneven, and that's okay. A little bit of unevenness is going to be lost in the seam allowance anyway. So, go ahead and put that off to the side. And then, when you unfold everything, I am going to leave this little bit of seam allowance just for a little bit of personal preferences, but if you so desire, you can go ahead and cut this seam allowance off. I'll just remember that I have to sew a little bit further. Some people, especially if you're using a machine, you might want to leave a little bit of extra seam allowance. If you prefer a larger seam allowance, I prefer a smaller seam allowance, but I'll show 2 different kinds of seam allowance in this video. So go ahead, pull it out, and then grab your project. We use the back side since it's a little bit flatter. And go ahead, it roughly fits the dimensions. As you can see, this lays over with just a little bit of excess, and that's exactly what you want. Here you can see a little better. There is a little bit of excess. Even on the top. And you'll see that'll disappear. We do want a little bit of extra on the top so that way you can fold it down inwards and make sure this doesn't fray on the outside and damages the lining. So with that, go ahead and fold your project up and put that back again to the side. Now we're going to be working right side to right side. So go ahead and flip your fabric. And because on this side I am losing those markings, I am going to go ahead and make them again on this side. If you have a denser pattern, like you have a striped pattern, or you have a plaid, or you have polka dots, you could probably forego this, just remembering I have to go 4 polka dots over. Or my seam allowance is the right hand side or left hand side of the blue stripe, for example. So little shortcuts like that are a great way to cut down a little bit of your time. But if you're ever unsure, don't hesitate to pin and mark. So just go ahead and put a couple of pins into your fabric. And then do it on the bottom as well. Now this is a directional fabric, so you're going to want to make sure that the bees, because most of them do face one way, are facing that one way. So that way you don't end up with an upside down fabric. Stuff like stripes or things like that don't usually have a directional pattern, but sometimes they do. This one isn't super directional heavy, so that's okay. Alrighty. Now if you weren't doing a pre-made seam or fold as your seam, you would go ahead and also pin this side. I pinned the open side and the bottom. You're gonna leave the top untouched for now. We will do that in just a few minutes. So now that you have that, go ahead and put that off to the side and grab your thread, your hand needles, and scissors. You can also use a smaller pair of shears, or you can use snippers, you can use small little scissors. I only grabbed my big fabric scissors, so we'll work with those for today. Go ahead and decide which thread you're going to use. For this project, yellow, black, orange, gold, or tan would work. Because the main fabric color of the bag is tan, that's what we're going to go with today. Go ahead and find your start and unravel. I like to use about an arm's length at a time, and then you fold it, and then you pull another arm's length or so. Go ahead and snip it. Put it down. Make sure there's no obvious wrinkles in it. And grab your hand needle. Obviously, you don't have to do it in that order. You can grab your hand needle and then your thread. Now, if you have trouble looping your thread through your needle, you can go ahead and use a needle threader. And then I just poke my needle right into my fabric to hold the needle while I thread it. You can, if you have a pin cushion, that's fine. If you have your pant leg is fine. Whatever, just you want to hold that needle. Even if you hold it by yourself or have a friend hold it, that's fine. You just want to hold it to prevent any kind of snags being formed in your thread. I've got that bit there, so I'm going to snip that off. And then go ahead, thank you, go ahead and tie a knot. I make a circle, and then I push the end in 3 times. And then you just pull. And there you have a knot. Usually I do end up getting this little bubble here, and that's fine. You're not going to see it. And then just snip off the end. And now you have your thread. There are 2 different ways to create a seam. And and I'm going to show you both of them. There is a back stitch, and that is a slightly more sturdy, and that's what we're going to use for the bottom hem. That stitch does take a lot more thread. It does take a little bit more time, but that's okay because it's extra sturdy. And then on the side, we're going to use a running back stitch. I'm not sure if that's the official name for it, but that's what I've always called it. And it is a mix of the running stitch and the back stitch. And we'll do that one as well. So let's start with our running back stitch, as it's the easiest of the two. There are a few different ways to hold your fabric, just like in crochet. There is no particular way to hold it. There is no exact way to hold it. You're going to hold it how you hold it. What I do, especially when I have a shorter amount of fabric, I bunch it up into my left hand. That way I have a much more reasonable workspace. We do need to go a little bit further down for our stitch, and it's going to be approximately an inch. We're going to go about 3/4 of an inch, just to have a little bit of safety. We'll go an inch. And then just go right ahead and pin it. Alright, so now that we have everything ready, go ahead and insert your thread and bring it up not too far away. Go ahead and pull that pin out and pull your thread through. Now you're going to grab, if you do have that little loopy, you're going to go ahead and grab that loop, pull your thread back through, and then push your thread, your needle right down in between those two stitches. And that's the creation of your first back stitch. And go ahead and pull back up through. So now that we have our sturdy back stitch, we're going to back stitch again. So put your needle between the last stitch and the stitch you just made. If I could get it through. And then push up just a little bit ahead. This time, instead of pulling all the way through, we're going to go ahead and running stitch and push through a couple of times. Doesn't matter if your stitch is exactly perfect between. After about 4 or 5 stitches, go ahead and pull your thread through. And it's going to make this gather, and that's perfectly normal. Just go ahead, straighten it out, and put another back stitch in. That simple. Let's do it again. Go ahead and put your stitch in between the stitch you just made and the stitch before that. Pull it through. Make a back stitch. Then start your back stitch again. Go through the back. Switch to a gather or a running stitch. Grab a couple of stitches. I usually do about 5 or 6 and pull through. Again, you get that gather effect. Just pull it straight, pull it flat, and back stitch. And that is your running gather. Your running back stitch, sorry. It creates a perfectly strong seam that doesn't require a whole lot of thread. In this instance, it's perfect because you're not going to be putting a whole lot of pressure on the side seams. So let's do it one more time. Back stitch. start your back stitch again. Grab a couple of stitches. That one's a bit too short. And if you come across a pin, just pull it out. Once you've done grabbing as many stitches as you're going to get, pull through. Again, it's going to gather. That's fine. Straighten it out. Straighten your thread out. Back stitch. One more time. And pull through. Alright, at this point, I'm about halfway done with my seam. I will catch back up with you when we're done. End of the seam. You can see I left a few stitches out, and that's because we're gonna tie off. And what you want to do to create a sturdy seam is you back stitch again, back stitch one more time but a little bit further back, and then in the middle of those 3 back stitches do a more sideways stitch, pull through but not all the way, leaving a hoop, and then you run your needle through 3 times and pull. Now you've got a nice knot. Now here I'm going to back stitch a few more times because it's a back. And every time you back stitch, you want to go back a little bit, and then I just running stitch up. And there you have your cast off. And go ahead and snip your thread. Now in this case, I'm left with a relatively short amount of thread. I'm not going to be able to do a lot with this, unfortunately. So we're going to toss this. If you are able to use quite a bit more, if you get a decent amount more, or you have a small project, or if you keep your scrap thread that is approximately about this length, if not a little bit longer, and you use it for small scrap projects, that is a great idea. I know a few people who do that. I do that myself as well. However, that bin is upstairs. So we're just going to ball this up. I just fold it a couple of times and then either put it in a bin or toss it out or use it for the bottom stitch that we're going to use. Now this stitch is a much sturdier stitch. It's just a pain in the butt. It takes a lot of thread and it takes quite a bit of time. Having said that, you can decide if you want to use the running back stitch or you want to use a solid back stitch. Before we get to that though, we got to clip our seam allowance. I'm going to give about a quarter of an inch, I'm going to give about a quarter of an inch of resting seam allowance. You can give however much you want. If you're going to keep this much seam allowance, this is about an inch of seam allowance. If you're going to keep that, that's fine. You're just going to have to iron it down, fold it down, and maybe even stitch it down to ensure that it doesn't create too much thickness in your bag. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and snip it off, and I'm just using the perforated holes in my fabric that were created when the fabric was made as my guide. And then this is just salvage. Not a whole lot else you can do with this, so we're just going to toss this. And now it's starting to look more like a bag. So now we have to do the bottom. Go ahead and grab your thread. This time I'm going to use quite a bit more because I do have a larger base, but this is a thread eater. Much like in a crochet pattern, you have the yarn eaters, you have thread eaters. Go ahead and snip it off, put your thread back to the side. Thread your needle. Oops. I'm going to go ahead and stick my needle into my fabric. And then grab your thread. Like I said, this time I'm using a significant more amount. English. I'm using a larger amount. And that's just because this is a heavier duty stitch. And here, as you can see, I don't have that loop. And that's perfectly fine. Sometimes you do get the loop, sometimes you don't. Just go ahead and trim it. And toss out that little itty bitty tail. So a good rule of thumb for when you are doing the running back stitch, you want your fabric to be, you want your thread to be twice as much as your fabric. So here you can see I've looped it in half, and it does well exceed the half limit. So I should have enough here. If you don't, that's fine. You can just cast off and then rethread your needle. Again, we're going to grab and bunch. Now here, because there is already a seam, we don't have to worry about starting with the seam, but it's going to be the same thing. You're going to go ahead, including your seam allowance, put your needle as close to the edge with a few millimeter or about a centimeter difference so that you are still grabbing quite a bit of the fabric. Go ahead and do a back stitch. Go ahead and do a back stitch. And pull through. Now, unlike with the other one where we could grab a couple of stitches, this one you don't. So go ahead and put your needle as close as physically possible to the last stitch and back stitch. And there you have it, the back stitch. Let's do it again. Take your needle, put it as physically close to the last stitch you made, and pull through. And there you have your back stitch. And this is a stitch that is great to sit in front of the TV with a movie, or if you have the kids or the dogs running around. This is a great thing that you can just sit there and work pretty mindlessly and just go. It does take a while, but it is a very sturdy stitch. You do want to try and get the stitches pretty uniform. I'm really bad at that, so my stitches are never uniform. But they have gotten a lot better, and with practice and a lot like with crochet, repetitive usage, you get pretty close to mastering it. So I'm going to go ahead and do a few more back stitches for you, and then I will meet you back up at the front. So back stitch. Back stitch. So now that we're at the end, we still have to tie off, and as you can see, the last handful of stitches, they got a little messy. That's because the thread is curling, the thread is twisting, and I was going kind of quickly. If you take your time, you go a little bit slower, you won't have so much of that issue, but the thread, it spins, it twirls, it catches on itself. It's gonna happen. So don't worry about it too much. So when we cast off or we knot off, you're gonna, if you already have a knot as your base, that's a pretty good place to stop. Go ahead and, if you can catch the knot itself, great. If you cannot, that's fine. Oh, not. Go ahead and sew it. 3. Alrighty, and then as we did the last time, back stitch a couple times. Just go. Running stitch. All right. Snip it. Now I'm left with a very short amount. This small amount you can't even get a knot out of, really. So this is the perfect amount to just throw in the trash. Alrighty, and that is how you sew the actual liner. So now that you have 2 or 3 seams, go ahead and grab your corners. I like to open the bag, get a little air in there, and then pinch the corners. And you're going to corner off. And you want the corner close enough to the edge that it's going to help make that corner sharper, but you don't want to grab the thread. If your seam allowance is too bulky, it's not going to get a nice sharp corner. If you're like me and the liner isn't going to be seen all the time, you don't have to worry about getting it too super sharp. But if you're doing another project where the corners are going to be seen, this is something that you might want to thin out over here. It's completely up to you. Now this side, you're like, how am I going to do that? You're going to do the same thing, just a little bit differently. So you're going to snip that corner off. And here you can see there is a much larger seam allowance on this side, but not on this side, because we didn't put a seam allowance on that side. You're just going to go ahead and trim it down a little bit. And then just kind of create a little hill down. Toss out your scraps. So here you can see you have your seam allowance and then it hills a little bit down. That's going to reduce some of the bulk on this corner, and that's going to help it corner out when you flip it out right side out. So now, go ahead and flip it out. I like to put my index fingers in the corners, pinch the fabric next to it, and then just pull it out. And then you can take your fingers or your scissors or a dowel, something, and just point those corners out. And you can roll them, massage them, knead them as much as possible. Here I didn't get a perfect corner because of the bulk, but it's okay. You can wiggle it around a little bit more. I'm not super worried about it. It's not going to be seen. Same on this side. Go ahead and get that corner out. This one popped out a lot easier. And there you can see this one has a really nice corner. That's a pretty good corner. So now you have your bag liner. And you can keep it like this, or you can do it the completely opposite way and do it wrong sides to wrong sides and have your bag lining that way. It doesn't matter. It's a bag liner. So now, because we do want this to be on the inside when we open it up, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our hem. And we're not going to sew this down yet because we still have to put it in. So just go ahead and pin it. You can use a ruler and you can get exactly 1/2 inch or 1/4 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, however you want it. I'm not that fussy. So I'm just going to eyeball it. And then once you get to the edges, if you have 2 seams, go ahead and flatten those seams. So open them up, if you can. Open them up and flatten them down like that. And then make your hem. That reduces some of the bulk. And you can use as many or little as you like. As long as you come to your seam. You continue around your hem. And your hem should be the same around. There are going to be some fluctuations and some variances, and that's fine. Now, because as I'm working this this fabric, it's fraying pretty quickly. We're going to do a rolled hem. And to do that, there's two ways. You can take and literally roll it down, and you can hide that hem, which works really well. Or you can take and do it the other way and roll it back. And you also get a perfectly rolled, very nicely rolled hem. I prefer rolling it this way and hiding it that way. However, we do have to flip it back outside. We have to flip it back out so that way this side is showing when we line the bag. So go ahead and fold it back out. Grabbing the corners. Realized I pinned it the wrong way. That's okay. Roll it back like that. Yeah, that way. Grab your project. Now for this, you can use a few different yarns, needles. You can use a fabric darner, cotton, nylon, whatever kind of darner you want. You can use the same needle we used to sew the cotton, or you can grab a bigger needle, the same just regular hand needle that you use to sew the cotton. I'm going to grab a thicker, heavier duty needle just because it's a little bit easier to see and a little bit easier to control. Go ahead and put your other needle away. If you put it in with your thread, go ahead and do that. If you have a little container for them, go ahead and do that. So now, take your liner, take your bag, and put them together. I'm going to do this off camera slightly so I can see a little bit better for me. Alrighty, so now that I have the seams lined up, I wanted mine a little bit further down, just to, you know, have a handle, make it look a little nicer. Now we can go ahead and start lining everything else up. And take your time with this. There's no need to rush. If your bag ends up being a little smaller because the cotton moves around, or whatever kind of yarn you're using moved around or stretched in the time that you made everything, that's fine. That happens. Just take your time, move everything around as it needs to be, and take your time. There's no need to rush things. That's one of the great things about crafting, is I could make 7 of these bags and they would still be unique in their own way. So, yeah, that's where it's going to be okay. It's fine. I will adjust that in a second. Now, right here is a perfect example. My bag is a little too short, or my lining is a little too small, and that's fine. That's something we'll address when we sew it down. So just go ahead and leave that unpinned for now. And do the back. Follow the seam line, or follow a line, make it a little bit more consistent. And again, right here, you can tell already that there's going to be a size issue, and that's fine. Like I said, if that happens, which is likely, especially when you're doing something as finicky as sewing, we can address this while we sew it down. It just means we're gonna whip it on a little bit differently. And it's not too much of an issue that you can just move the yarn around and it flattened itself out perfectly. Okay, so after some wiggling around, and I did move it down a little bit, all of the big holes are gone. There are still a few little holes, but that's just because it's not pinned and it's got to be flattened out. Don't be afraid to move your liner up or down. Don't be afraid to rework things. Don't be afraid to completely start scratch with your liner. Not everything is going to come out perfect on the first time. So, having said that, let's sew. You're going to take your needle, and depending on where you're going to start, I'm going to start here in the front because it's what I have already. You're going to go in the back of your liner, and that's going to hide your knot. I'm going to go down a little bit just to hide that knot. You're going to make a super small stitch, and you're going to go back out. This is going to be your anchor. This is what's going to give you a little bit of strength. I'm just going to whip stitch. I'm going to make a bunch of really small whip stitches around. So you're going to grab into your yarn and grab a couple of bits. Go in through your fabric, so you're grabbing some of your yarn, grabbing a couple of stitches there, and then just pull through. And that's your first stitch. Then you're going to go over to your next crochet stitch, grab a couple of pieces of yarn, pop down, grab a centimeter, grab a couple millimeters of lining, and pull through. Onto the next part of that crochet stitch. Grab a couple, pop down, in through the cotton, and pull. And you do get a very small stitch, but if you're using a corresponding color, you're not going to see it too much. So go ahead and grab some yarn, pop through the cotton, and pop through. And you just keep doing this around your whole bag. There are a couple of other ways you can do this. You can do the running gather. You can do just a regular running stitch. You can do a back stitch. You can do the back gather. There are some ways that you can do this without any sewing. There are so many ways you can do it, and the way I'm showing you is just one way. If this way doesn't work out for you, don't hesitate to try things on your own. That is a big part of crafting and crochet, is don't hesitate to take something and learn off of it. So, you're going to keep grabbing a couple of stitches, grab a couple of strands, pop into your cotton, and if you get to a point where you've pretty much completely gone by a pin, just take the pin out and put it away. There's no need to keep poking yourself. Grab some yarn, grab some cotton, and pull through. So, I will see you when we get back to the other side. Okay, so once you have tied off, you just hide your stitch and hide your knot in the back, do a couple of back stitches, and that's going to be the approximate how it's going to look. It's not the prettiest, but you're not really going to see it unless you're looking. I did run out of thread halfway through, and I just knotted it off the same fashion I did with this, and started a new thread the same way I started here. It's a pretty functional bag. If you wanted, you could add some kind of a closing mechanism, a clasp, or you could do a button, however you wanted to close it, if you wanted it to be closable. This we're just going to leave open, and there you go. That is how you line a bag.